And of course, since we were talking about the disaster that cost the end of the Challenger, we cannot talk about shuttle disasters without, of course, also mentioning the Columbia mission STS-107. Now, unlike the previous shuttle flight, and unlike Apollo 1, STS-107 had actually completed its mission. Its mission was a scientific mission in which they would conduct experiments on board the shuttle. It did not actually rendezvous with the International Space Station. It instead had a Space Lab module tucked inside the payload bay. I'm uncertain as to why they just did this on a shuttle instead of bringing the experiments onto ISS. There might have been a reason for that, like they needed to be in a different orbit that the ISS did not maintain. But as for the crew, we have mostly space rookies with some veterans. Veteran of 2 flights and commander of the flight, Rick Husband. The pilot in his first flight, William McCool. First flight, Mission Specialist 1, David Brown. Second flight, Mission Specialist 2, Kalpana Chawla. I might be mispronouncing that. Second flight, Mission Specialist 3, Michael Anderson. First flight, Mission Specialist 4, Laurel Clark. And Payload Specialist 1 in his first flight, looks like from Israel, Ilan Ramon. So Columbia's mission overall was a success. They completed their mission of 15 days and 22 hours. But what happened was, on ascent, a piece of foam insulation had broken off of the external tank and struck the orbiter on the left wing. Now, there have been foam impacts before. Sometimes they glance off the hull, sometimes they damage some of the thermal tiles, but they've always been viewed as trivial because it's just foam, and any dinged tiles or ruptured tiles had not spelled significant failure. Well, this one was of particular devastation as it punctured through they weren't really tiles. They were large panels on the wing that were meant to absorb the greatest heat load of re-entry. And what they could not tell at the time was this impact had actually punched a giant hole in that part of the wing. So when Columbia came down, the hot gas, superheated plasma that surrounds your craft during re-entry, hot gas seeped through that hole into the left wing and began to tear out instrumentation. Tearing out instruments, they lost the temperature sensors, which read as off-scale low, which is unpowered state. They read loss of pressure in the tire wheel, so it probably ruptured the tire. So if it came down, it probably wouldn't have been able to come down on a proper landing anyway. But finally ruptured the supports inside the wing until the wing itself tore completely off. And at that point, the orbiter began to barrel out of control, and it was only probably a matter of seconds before it was reduced to just a bunch of debris. There was no radio contact at the time, even though the radio blackout that typically accompanies reentry is no longer a factor as they bounce radio signals off of satellites. But the radio signal was lost during the breakup, so there is no actual way to determine what the crew had experienced, whether their death was instant or whether they had experienced the tumble before the craft had broken up. I would like to think at that velocity, at that heat, it would have been out, but we'll never know. Probably best that we don't.
Now, did this incident make any major change in design or procedure?
Design, no. Procedure, yes. Every shuttle launch was already observed by cameras during ascent, but they've added several extra to observe every angle for any insulation that came off, any foam strikes, any abnormality during ascent. And after ascent, they would review that footage extensively. Also, from this point, every single shuttle mission that launched would rendezvous with the International Space Station and perform a slow backflip and roll maneuver. So crew members on board the International Space Station could gather footage of its surface, but also visually observe it and attempt to find any damage that either could potentially be repaired or if a rescue was necessary.
It's a good old-fashioned visual inspection.
Yes. There is one instance where rendezvous was not accomplished, and that was the final servicing mission of the Hubble Space Telescope, which was STS-125. Because of the altitude that Hubble is at and the orbit inclination, there's no way for a shuttle to reach ISS and still reach Hubble, as it would not have nearly enough fuel. The Hubble's orbit is at the absolute peak of the shuttle's fuel capacity, which is at roughly, I believe, perigee of 486 kilometers or 302 miles, apogee 578 kilometers or 359 miles. Because they could not rendezvous with visual inspection, they still had the camera at all angles to observe the takeoff, but they also included an extension to the remote arm in which they would be able to mount a camera and reach further than the arm could typically go to get a closer look at all of the orbiter's surface so they could see if there is any damage. Also, as an extra safety measure, the shuttle Endeavour was standing by on the pad as a launch on need contingency mission labeled as STS-400. So if there was a problem with Atlantis in STS-125 and the orbiter could conceivably not survive re-entry, they would send up the Endeavour to rendezvous with it and transfer the crew from Atlantis to Endeavour and come back. STS-400 was never needed, and every other mission was a servicing mission to ISS, so they could always perform the visual maneuver and actually have the station to stay on and survive on until a rescue was necessary. Which is one unfortunate thing, that without the shuttle, we cannot perform any more servicing missions to the Hubble, which is its latest service extended its life on paper as 2018, and they're confident it can reach 2020. But unless we have another craft to reach it before then, things are likely to start failing. And we really don't want to Hubble has really been one of the best things to happen to NASA, and we don't want to lose it.
We've started from the first, and we've gone through history and worked our way to closer to present day. Was that the most recent death?
Yes.
So we haven't had any more since then?
No, we have not.
I call that a success.
Oh, certainly. And it should also be noted, I mentioned the Chinese Shenzhou, which is basically a upgraded copy of the Soyuz. They have not had a single launch failure, manned or unmanned, of their craft. Not just talking human lives, but I mean in no launch aborts needed, no orbit failures that had to be brought down early. Even Mercury and Gemini can't boast that. So I'm actually very excited and hopeful to see Shenzhou fly again. They're probably waiting until they have the next Tiangong station module to fly in an orbit before they launch another manned mission. And this is probably gibberish to most of you, as the American television and media says absolutely nothing of the Chinese space exploits.
Yeah, I've never seen anything about it.
that being said, I will continue with the pre-produced program, we'll call it. I've got 2 more I intend to get up in short order. For now, I believe it is about time for us to step away and move on from the somber tone we have unfortunately set for this program. But of course, everyone involved deserves to be remembered just as much as any soldier who has given his life in the service of his country. Is the proper term Happy Memorial Day?
Yes. I believe so, yes.
So I will amend that just a bit. Happy Memorial Day, never forget. So I realized it was kind of hard to interject anything during all that, but I'd like to thank everyone for joining me. Mr. Headshot, Mr. Tim G, Dancing Crow, Raiderman, Gavin Tar, and Z-Snipe, who had to duck out a little earlier. We will see you also in short order for This Week in Science and Technology. For now, this is K1. This has been RadiOdyssey 50 Years of Space direct to YouTube, and we will see you again very soon.